On January 4th, 46 BCE, fate opened one of its cruelest stages beneath the African sun. On that unforgiving shore stood the most brilliant military commander Rome had ever known, his boots pressed into hot sand, his sharp eyes fixed on a horizon that promised only death. Julius Caesar watched as 16,000 enemy warriors closed in on just 1,000 Roman soldiers. The air was heavy, not only with dust, but with the weight of history about to turn. Caesar had crossed into Africa to erase the final shadows of Pompey's cause, believing the civil war nearly finished after Pompey's death in Egypt. Instead, annihilation waited for him in the barren hills outside Ruspina. Imagine the scene clearly. A single Roman column, cloaks glowing red against endless yellow sand, completely surrounded by Numidian cavalry. Their war cries crashed against the rocks and hills, rolling like thunder before a violent storm. The numbers were brutal and undeniable, 16 enemies for every Roman. No reinforcements within 50 miles. No clear path of escape through a living wall of horsemen who flowed like desert wind, appearing and vanishing behind swirling dust clouds that turned the afternoon sun into a blood-red disk. Caesar's political danger was just as severe as the military one. The war that had torn Rome apart was supposed to end cleanly, but it did not. Cato the Younger and Scipio had rebuilt the Republican resistance in North Africa with frightening speed. Together, they commanded nearly 60,000 men, including the feared Numidian cavalry of King Juba. These warriors were born on horseback, trained from childhood to ride, shoot, and vanish. They could send 3 arrows into the air before a Roman even touched his gladius. Far away in Rome, Caesar's enemies waited patiently. One major defeat, one shattered legion, and they would tear away his power, his reputation, and his future. This was no ordinary campaign. This moment was Caesar's final gamble for absolute power. The day itself had begun like countless others, a routine foraging mission. Caesar needed supplies for his 6 weakened legions camped near the coast. African grain was scarce, water even scarcer, and his men had survived on half rations for weeks. The land itself favored the enemy. Unlike Gaul with its forests and rivers, Africa offered wide open plains where cavalry ruled without challenge. Roman heavy infantry, designed for tight formations and close combat, struggled to breathe and move in such terrain. By mid-morning, the temperature climbed past 90 degrees. Roman armor turned into burning shells, cooking men inside bronze and leather under a merciless sky. What the chronicles rarely admit is how blind Caesar was that morning. His trusted Germanic cavalry, once so deadly in Europe, were nearly useless here. Their heavy horses could not match Numidian speed. Their weapons were wrong for desert warfare. Worse still, they had never faced enemies who could shoot accurately while retreating at full gallop. Caesar's intelligence failed him completely. His scouts reported only a few hundred raiders. The truth was far darker. King Juba's finest force had been waiting, 16,000 elite cavalry led by Labienus, Caesar's former lieutenant. A man who knew Roman tactics intimately because he had helped create them. This trap had been set over months. Cato and Scipio understood Caesar perfectly. They knew he needed victories, needed them quickly, and needed them to be spectacular. They knew he would chase what looked like easy success. The foraging expedition was perfect bait. Caesar could not resist leading it himself, bringing enough men to appear strong, but far too few to survive what lay ahead. The enemy studied Roman supply lines, movement patterns, and even Roman pride. They understood Caesar's boldness and his belief that doctrine existed to be broken. When the first dust clouds appeared on the horizon, Caesar's centurions should have ordered an immediate retreat to the coast. Roman doctrine was clear: never face superior cavalry in open terrain. But Caesar had spent 6 years in Gaul proving that rules were made for lesser commanders. Now, the greatest military mind of the age was about to learn that African warfare obeyed different laws. The Numidians moved like water around stone. They did not rush in, they circled, watched, and waited. Fear became their first weapon. What followed would decide whether discipline could defeat impossible odds, whether genius could overcome mathematics, and whether Caesar's legendary luck would survive in a land where empires went to die. The cavalry struck like a living sandstorm. They appeared everywhere at once, yet never close enough for Roman steel to strike. By the second hour of what was meant to be a simple mission, Caesar's 1,000 men were trapped in a nightmare of speed and precision. The enemy rode in perfect circles, staying just beyond javelin range, releasing arrows in careful volleys that fell like deadly rain onto shields raised against the burning sun. Fresh riders replaced tired ones without pause, creating an endless cycle of attack that Roman infantry could not answer. Labienus directed the assault with cruel precision. He knew exactly how Roman formations reacted under pressure. He used that knowledge like a blade, testing and slicing at weaknesses he once helped design. False charges forced the Romans into defensive squares, only for the attackers to pull away at the last moment. Each movement drained Roman strength. Each retreat mocked their helplessness. Bronze armor trapped heat, lungs burned, legs trembled, and still the arrows came. As the sun reached its highest point, the killing truly began. Numidian javelins slipped through narrow gaps between shields. Veterans who had survived Gaul and Germania fell to weapons they never saw. Thrown from horseback at full speed, striking from impossible distances. The wounded could not be moved. They lay within the formation, their cries adding to exhaustion and fear. Discipline held, but doubt began to creep into hardened faces as the hours passed and no Roman blade could strike back. Then the final truth revealed itself. This was not random harassment. It was herding. Slowly, carefully, the Numidian cavalry had driven the Roman formation southeast, away from the coast and away from hope. The ground changed beneath their feet. Low hills rose around them, forming a natural amphitheater. Enemy riders attacked from above while Roman infantry struggled uphill through loose sand that pulled at their sandals like a living trap. In that moment, Caesar understood the full scale of his defeat. He had been out-generaled by his former student. Labienus was not merely commanding cavalry. He was conducting a flawless symphony of destruction, turning Roman strength and predictability into fatal weaknesses. The psychological assault deepened the damage. Numidian war cries echoed across the hills in harsh, unfamiliar tongues. Captured Roman standards were raised and displayed, proof that other legions had already fallen to African tactics. Riders shouted Latin insults learned from deserters, calling Romans cowards hiding behind shields because they feared real combat. Every insult was designed to provoke a break in formation, a reckless charge, a single mistake that would end everything. By the fourth hour, Caesar faced a crisis that threatened to destroy more than just his army. His Germanic cavalry, the horsemen who had won him Gaul, proved utterly inadequate against Numidian mobility. Their heavy mounts and European tactics were like siege engines in a foot race. When they charged, the Numidians scattered like startled birds, only to reform and attack the now isolated Germans from behind. 3 separate cavalry actions ended with Caesar's horsemen streaming back to the protection of the infantry squares. Their mounts eldered and exhausted, while the enemy seemed as fresh as morning. The mathematics of attrition were becoming impossible to ignore. Roman arrows were finite, water was running low, and the African sun was turning armor into instruments of torture. Meanwhile, the Numidians seemed to multiply rather than diminish. Fresh squadrons appearing on distant ridges like mirages that resolved into deadly reality. Caesar counted enemy banners from a dozen different tribes, all united under Juba's authority and Labienus' tactical genius. What he faced wasn't just cavalry. It was a confederation of the finest light horsemen in the ancient world, warriors whose ancestors had been fighting mounted warfare since before Rome was founded. Then Caesar did something no Roman general had ever attempted in open battle against cavalry. Caesar's revolutionary decision emerged from pure desperation, transformed into tactical genius. Instead of maintaining the traditional Roman square formation that made his men sitting targets for Numidian arrows, he ordered something never before attempted against cavalry in open terrain. His 1,000 legionaries would form a single extended line, 4 men deep, stretching nearly half a mile across the valley floor. To every centurion who heard the command, it sounded like suicide. Extended lines were for fighting infantry, not mobile horsemen who could concentrate their entire force against any weak point. But Caesar had seen something in the Numidian attack patterns that even Labienus had missed. The transformation took 20 minutes of agonizing vulnerability. Roman sentries wheeled and extended while arrows continued to fall, men dropping as they struggled to maintain formation during the most dangerous maneuver in ancient warfare. The Numidians pressed their advantage, sensing Roman confusion, sending wave after wave of horsemen against what appeared to be a formation in complete disarray. Caesar moved along the line personally, his purple cloak making him a target for every enemy archer. But his presence kept exhausted legionaries from breaking as they extended into what looked like a human sacrifice to Numidian mobility. Here's where legend meets tactical reality. Caesar wasn't just gambling on courage against mathematics. He had identified the fatal flaw in Numidian tactics that not even Labienus understood. The enemy cavalry's greatest strength, their ability to concentrate overwhelming force against any point, required them to mass together for maximum impact. But massing horsemen created vulnerability in terrain where maneuver space was limited. Caesar's extended line would force the Numidians to choose between attacking in small groups, negating their numerical advantage, or concentrating in areas where the surrounding hills would restrict their escape routes. The first test came when 2,000 Numidian horsemen charged the Roman center, expecting to shatter the thin line like pottery against stone. Instead, they found themselves funneled between rocky outcrops into a killing zone where Roman javelins could reach them, and their own mobility became a liability. The legionaries didn't try to hold ground in the traditional sense. They gave way in calculated retreats that drew the horsemen deeper into terrain that favored heavy infantry. When the Numidians wheeled to escape, they found themselves trapped between converging Roman wings that had closed like the jaws of a trap. The slaughter in that narrow valley bottom lasted less than 10 minutes but changed everything. Numidian horses, bred for speed on open plains, stumbled on loose rocks and thorny scrub. Riders who had terrorized Romans all morning suddenly found themselves within gladius range of veterans, who had been waiting hours for this moment. The sound of iron on bone echoed off the hillsides, as Roman discipline met Numidian desperation in close combat that favored neither speed nor arrows but pure savagery. 300 enemy horsemen died in that valley, their bodies marking the first Roman success of a day that had seemed destined for disaster. But Caesar's tactical masterstroke went beyond that single engagement. The extended line created multiple simultaneous combats across the valley, preventing Labienus from coordinating his forces effectively. Instead of one overwhelming attack, the Numidians found themselves fighting dozens of smaller actions, where their mobility advantage disappeared and Roman training became decisive. Century by century, swordstroke by swordstroke, the legionaries proved that close combat remained their domain regardless of how many arrows had fallen on their shields. The psychological impact rippled through both armies faster than battlefield messengers could carry news. Roman cheers rose from the valley floor as men, who had been preparing to die, suddenly saw victory within reach. Conversely, Numidian war cries faltered as warriors who had never faced effective resistance from Roman infantry watched their comrades fall in terrain that should have favored cavalry. The mathematical certainty of 16-to-1 odds began wavering, as tactical innovation met cultural arrogance in combat that neither side had anticipated. Labienus watched his perfect trap transform into Caesar's killing ground, and understood that his former commander had once again rewritten the rules of warfare. The Numidian advantage required open terrain and freedom to maneuver. Caesar had used the landscape itself to neutralize both, turning African geography against African tactics, with a precision that only years of European campaigning could have taught him. What happened in the next 30 minutes would determine whether tactical genius could overcome numerical impossibility, whether Roman innovation could defeat Numidian tradition, and whether Caesar's legendary fortune extended to African sand. The decisive moment arrived when Caesar recognized that Labienus had committed his reserve cavalry to reinforce the failed valley attack. In 17 minutes of calculated audacity, Caesar would either vindicate his tactical revolution or watch his last army die on African sand. The Roman line had held through 3 separate Numidian charges. But Caesar could see exhaustion etching lines on veteran faces beneath bronze helmets that had become furnaces in the desert heat. Sweat mixed with blood on gladius hilts made weapons slippery. The wounded lay in growing numbers behind the extended formation, their groans a constant reminder that Roman endurance had limits. Even tactical genius couldn't extend indefinitely. Then Caesar spotted the opening that would define his legend. Labienus had pulled warriors from his left wing to support the valley engagement, creating a gap in the Numidian encirclement nearly 300 wide. It was a fleeting opportunity, visible only to a commander who understood both Roman capabilities and enemy psychology. Caesar had perhaps 5 minutes before Numidian mobility closed the gap. 5 minutes to achieve what no Roman army had managed against superior cavalry in open African terrain. He would not just break the encirclement. He would shatter it so completely that psychological shock would multiply tactical success into strategic victory. The charge began with Caesar's personal intervention that became military legend. Taking 2 centuries of his finest veterans, men who had followed him from Gaul through civil war to African exile, he led them personally toward the gap in enemy lines. His purple cloak streamed behind him as he ran, making him visible to every Roman and Numidian on the battlefield. The sight of their commander charging on foot transformed exhausted legionaries into an unstoppable human battering ram. Centuries that had been barely holding defensive positions suddenly found strength for offensive action that defied both mathematics and military logic. The impact when Romans met Numidians in the gap created a sound that witnesses described as thunder wrapped in screaming. Horses reared and fell as gladi found their bellies. Riders who had terrorized infantry all morning suddenly faced disciplined steel in terrain where speed meant nothing and training everything. The collision lasted perhaps 3 minutes, but those minutes decided the battle. Roman heavy infantry designed for close combat proved devastating against cavalry caught without room to maneuver. Every sword stroke was calculated, every shield push coordinated, every step forward bought with Numidian blood that darkened the sand beneath their feet. Here's what happened next that military historians still debate. The breakthrough created a cascade effect that no tactical manual had ever described. As Caesar's assault force punched through enemy lines, the extended Roman formation suddenly contracted like a closing fist. Instead of maintaining their defensive stance, the legionaries began advancing simultaneously across the entire valley. What had been a desperate defensive action transformed into a coordinated offensive that caught 16,000 Numidians completely unprepared for Roman aggression in terrain they had controlled all day. Labienus watched his tactical masterpiece disintegrate in real time, as Roman discipline met Numidian confusion in dozens of separate combats. His horsemen trained for mobility warfare found themselves fighting at close quarters, where their advantages disappeared and Roman weapons dominated. The psychological shock rippled through tribal contingents that had never faced effective infantry resistance. Warriors who had been pressing attack all morning suddenly found themselves defending against an enemy they had written off as defeated. The role reversal happened so quickly that many Numidians didn't understand what was occurring until Roman steel was already among them. The slaughter began in earnest when Numidian morale cracked under pressure no desert warrior had anticipated. Entire squadrons that had been circling Roman positions like wolves around wounded prey suddenly broke and fled toward distant hills. Abandoning wounded comrades and tactical positions that had taken hours to establish. The sound of retreat, horses galloping away from battle, created a psychological avalanche that spread faster than any battlefield messenger. Within minutes, organized Numidian resistance collapsed into individual survival, as 16,000 warriors decided that discretion trumped valor when facing Romans who refused to die quietly. Caesar seized the moment with predatory instincts that separated genius from competence. Instead of celebrating survival, he ordered immediate pursuit. Roman centuries that had been fighting desperately for their lives suddenly found themselves hunting enemies who had terrorized them all morning. The reversal was so complete, so sudden that many legionaries later claimed they couldn't believe what their own eyes were showing them. They had gone from mathematical impossibility to tactical dominance in less time than it took the African sun to move 1 degree across the merciless sky. But the true magnitude of Caesar's victory would only become clear when the killing finally stopped. And the accountants began counting bodies scattered across sand that had been yellow at dawn and was red by afternoon. The pursuit lasted until the African sun touched the western horizon, transforming Caesar's defensive victory into a slaughter that would echo through military history. Roman centuries, energized by their impossible survival, chased fleeing Numidians across 12 mi of desert terrain that had favored cavalry all morning, but now became a trap for warriors. Too panicked to use their mobility effectively, the mathematical reversal was staggering. By sunset, Caesar's 1,000 men had killed nearly 4,000 Numidian horsemen, while losing fewer than 200 of their own. Bodies littered the valley floor and surrounding hills like dark stones scattered across yellow sand, marking the path of a route so complete that witnesses struggled to believe what they had witnessed. The immediate aftermath revealed the true scope of Caesar's tactical revolution. Labienus himself barely escaped capture, abandoning his command position when it became clear that organized resistance had collapsed into individual flight. His carefully coordinated battle plan, months in preparation, had disintegrated in less than an hour once Roman discipline met Numidian shock in terrain that neutralized cavalry advantages. Among the enemy dead lay chieftains from 6 different tribes, their ornate weapons and armor testament to the political coalition that Caesar had shattered along with their military formation. King Juba's finest cavalry, warriors who had never known defeat in African warfare, lay scattered across the battlefield like broken promises of easy Roman destruction. The Roman wounded told their own story of impossible odds, overcome through discipline and desperation. Men who had taken multiple arrow wounds continued fighting, because retreat meant death and advance offered hope. Centurions reported that soldiers had performed feats of endurance that should have been physically impossible, driven by the knowledge that survival depended entirely on collective action. The extended line formation that had seemed suicidal at midday was now hailed as genius, though Caesar privately admitted that desperation had contributed as much as tactical insight to its success. Without the terrain constraints that funneled Numidian attacks into Roman killing zones, the outcome might have been catastrophically different. Here's what the victory meant strategically beyond the immediate tactical success. Caesar had proven that Roman heavy infantry could defeat superior cavalry numbers in open terrain when properly deployed and led. The psychological impact rippled across North Africa faster than news of the battle itself. Tribal chieftains who had been preparing to join Juba's coalition suddenly reconsidered their allegiances when reports arrived of Numidian elite cavalry, broken by a handful of Roman centuries. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded African mounted warfare since Hannibal's time cracked like sun-baked clay, replaced by renewed respect for Roman military innovation. The captured equipment revealed the scope of enemy preparation and the magnitude of their defeat. Roman quartermasters catalogued thousands of arrows, javelins, and cavalry lances abandoned in the route. More importantly, they recovered intelligence documents that exposed the full extent of the conspiracy against Caesar. Letters from Cato detailed coordination with Egyptian and Syrian resistance, while Scipio's correspondence revealed planned naval operations designed to cut Caesar's African supply lines. The victory at Ruspina had disrupted more than a single battle. It had shattered a comprehensive strategy designed to destroy Caesar's remaining forces through coordinated pressure from multiple directions. The personal transformation in Caesar himself became visible to every subordinate who had witnessed his leadership during the crisis. The commander, who had seemed almost casual about African dangers, now displayed the focused intensity of someone who understood how close he had come to complete destruction. His orders became more precise, his tactical preparations more thorough, his treatment of local populations more calculated to prevent future coalition building. The near disaster had taught him that African warfare required different approaches than European campaigns, lessons that would prove crucial in subsequent operations against Cardau and Scipio. But perhaps the most significant immediate consequence was the effect on Roman morale throughout Caesar's African army. News of the victory spread through his coastal camps like wildfire, transforming dispirited legions who had been questioning their commander's judgment into confident troops, ready to face whatever enemies Africa could produce. The soldiers who had survived Ruspina became instant legends, their account of tactical innovation and disciplined courage inspiring entire cohorts that had never seen combat. Veterans who had followed Caesar from Gaul spoke of Ruspina as proof that their commander's legendary fortune extended even to African sand. While newer recruits gained confidence that Roman training could overcome any odds when properly applied. As darkness fell on the battlefield, Caesar stood among the bodies of enemies who had surrounded his 1,000 men 12 hours earlier, and understood that this victory had changed more than tactical doctrine. It had preserved his African campaign, disrupted enemy strategy, and demonstrated once again that audacity, combined with discipline, could achieve mathematical impossibilities that lesser commanders would never attempt. The victory at Ruspina transformed Caesar's African campaign from desperate survival into systematic conquest. Within 6 weeks of the battle, 3 major cities opened their gates to Roman legions rather than face siege by the commander, who had turned impossible odds into tactical doctrine. Thapsus fell after a single day's fighting when Numidian cavalry refused to charge Roman formations that might employ the devastating extended line tactics. Utica surrendered without resistance when its defenders learned that Caesar had developed methods for defeating superior cavalry numbers in open terrain. The psychological impact of one afternoon's fighting rippled across North Africa like earthquake tremors, shattering alliances that had taken Cato months to forge. The tactical innovations pioneered at Ruspina became standard Roman doctrine within a generation. Military engineers studied Caesar's use of terrain to channel cavalry attacks into infantry killing zones. Staff officers analyzed how extended formations could neutralize mobility advantages when properly supported by disciplined reserves. Most importantly, Roman commanders learned that tactical flexibility could overcome mathematical disadvantages when desperation was transformed into calculated aggression. The extended line formation appeared in subsequent battles across Africa, Syria, and eventually on the Germanic frontier, proving that innovation born from crisis could become systematic doctrine. But Ruspina's influence extended beyond Roman military thinking. Numidian cavalry tactics, unchanged for centuries, evolved rapidly after their defeat by Caesar's thousand. Desert warriors who had relied purely on mobility and harassment began incorporating close combat training and coordinated formations designed to counter Roman innovations. The battle forced an entire military culture to adapt or face obsolescence, demonstrating that even traditional advantages could be neutralized by tactical creativity under pressure. The personal consequences for key commanders shaped the final phase of Rome's civil wars. Labienus never recovered from the psychological shock of being outgenerated by his former mentor, using principles he thought he understood. His subsequent tactical decisions became increasingly conservative, contributing to Republican defeats at Thepsus and ultimately at Munda, where Caesar's veterans proved unstoppable. Cato's suicide at Utica stemmed partly from his realization that Roman military superiority had become unshakable, after Caesar proved that Republican forces couldn't match Caesarian innovation even when supported by the finest allied troops in the ancient world. The battle's legacy lived in the soldiers who survived it and the stories they told for decades afterward. Veterans of Ruspina formed the backbone of legions that conquered Egypt, fought at Actium, and eventually established the Principate under Augustus. Their first-hand knowledge of tactical innovation under impossible pressure became informal doctrine passed down through centurion ranks. When later Roman armies faced similar challenges, they applied lessons learned on African sand, where 1,000 men had proved that discipline could multiply force more effectively than numbers could overwhelm training. Here's what military historians recognize about Ruspina's broader significance. The battle demonstrated that tactical innovation could emerge from crisis when commanders possessed both the knowledge to recognize opportunity and the authority to implement radical solutions. Instantly, Caesar's success required not just personal courage, but systematic understanding of infantry capabilities, cavalry limitations, and terrain advantages that most generals would have missed under pressure. The extended line formation worked because Caesar understood Roman strengths well enough to risk everything on tactical theories that existed nowhere in military manuals. Modern staff colleges still examine Ruspina as the perfect example of defensive action transformed into offensive victory through leadership that refused to accept mathematical inevitability. The principles Caesar applied, using enemy strength against enemy assumptions while maximizing friendly advantages in unexpected contexts, remain relevant wherever inferior forces face superior numbers. The battle proves that tactical genius can emerge from desperate circumstances when preparation meets opportunity in the crucible of combat that tests every assumption about what's possible. The philosophical heart of Ruspina echoes through military history like a constant reminder that human will can overcome mathematical certainty when applied with precise understanding of capabilities and limitations. Caesar's 1,000 men faced 16,000 enemies not because they were braver or stronger, but because they were better led, better trained, and better able to adapt traditional methods to unprecedented challenges. They proved that impossible odds become possible when tactical innovation meets disciplined execution in circumstances that demand both. On January 4, 46 BCE, Julius Caesar watched 1,000 Roman soldiers prove that mathematical impossibility yields to tactical genius when desperation is transformed into calculated audacity, and in doing so demonstrated that the greatest victories emerge not from superior numbers, but from superior thinking applied under pressure that would break ordinary men.